Our next speaker is Dr. Marlene Zuk, and she is from the University of Minnesota, and we'll be talking about how behavior evolves and why it matters.
Thanks. I've really enjoyed all of the talks so far, and I hope I can live up to those that have been the ones previously. And what I'm going to talk to you about is coming partly from a book that I wrote called Dancing Cockadoos and Dead Man Test, and partly from a paper that I did with Hamish Spencer about killing the behavioral zombie. So I am going to talk about the evolution of behavior. And when you say you work in behavior, and I work in animal behavior, the first thing that everybody wants to know is whether a trait, like whether it's intelligence or sexual orientation or what you like to eat, is that trait, they always say, genetic, or is it learned? Is it inherent? Is it environmental? Is it pre-programmed, changeable, instinctive, cultural, what have you? Because that seems to be the important thing they want to know. And this has gotten kind of some re-interest lately, in part because of genomic techniques that allow us to find out the so-called genetic basis for a lot of behaviors that actually are kind of unlikely to be linked to genes, but nonetheless, people want to talk about this. For example, dog ownership was calculated. This is remarkably precise. Scientists calculated that genetics is responsible for 57% of dog ownership in women and 51% in men. Or they talk about the role of genetics in the likelihood of getting divorced, or your income, or sexual orientation has been a long-standing favorite for this. There was actually a whole section in the BBC Futures magazine called How Genetics Determine Our Life Choices, which is an interesting combination of this, in which they asked how much of our behavior is predetermined by our underlying biology. And so within that, they talk about a number of different behaviors, including exercise, and says, our genetics govern both how much you enjoy exercising and whether you prefer more solitary forms of physical activity, such as running. And this idea about genetics is determining our life choices is part of this real either-or thinking that always seems to come up when people want to talk about behavior. So these are the first two here are both quotes from, again, the BBC Futures thing, where it says, for many scientists, it's begun to raise the question, to what extent is our behavior the product of our own volition, and how much is simply predetermined by our underlying biology? But so far it seems that with all talents, and then they've got this weird kind of second, undermining thing. So far it seems that with all talents, whether that is number crunching, musical ability, or athletic prowess, genetics is just a relatively small part of the equation. Well, okay, but nonetheless, this is called How Genetics Determines Our Life Choices. And the last quote is from my friend and co-author Hamish Spencer, who's at the University of Otago in New Zealand. The tactic of including a disclaimer and then going on as if you didn't say it is what a friend of mine calls carry on regardless. It's a great defense against criticism, even though you don't really mean it. And, of course, what I'm talking about here is what you all know as the nature-nurture controversy. I love this T-shirt, I really do, and because it's true, right? It's completely true. But this is the nature-nurture controversy. We've been arguing about this for, literally centuries. And I really think that certainly scientists and probably all educated people would concede that it's kind of, it's a false dichotomy. We don't really want to talk about things like this. And yet, it's become what you might call a zombie idea in science. And which means that it's this idea that no matter how many times we think we've debunked it, no matter how many times we've talked about how it doesn't really work, it never really seems to go away. And I think that this argument is particularly fraught when we're talking about behavioral traits. You know, honestly, people don't care that much about whether your liver is the size that it is because of, is it genes or is it the environment, is it nature, nurture? I mean, if you are interested, by the way, it is both, because, you know, what you eat can affect, anyway, so it is both, but nobody cares. Our biggest controversies, and really even our biggest social issues, center around whether behavior has to do more with the environment or more with our genes. And here's just a couple of recent examples from the New York Times. There was an opinion piece right around the height of the Me Too movement called The Unexamined Brutality of the Male Libido, which got literally thousands of comments within hours. And you know, one of the questions that's posed in it is, how are we supposed to create an equal world when male mechanisms of desire are inherently brutal? And so there's that word inherent. There was also, more recently, another op-ed piece saying that maternal instinct is a myth that men created. I'm going to argue for you that, in fact, all instincts are a myth that people created, not just men, but we'll get to that in a second. Before I do that, though, I want to, we're going to take a little side trip, because before I continue with talking about how behavior is particularly subject to this kind of argumentation, I want to just ask what behavior is. And this is, we're going to have a little bit of audience participation. It's nothing embarrassing. It's nothing, you know, it's all going to be fine. But just prepare yourself. As I'm going to ask the question, what is behavior? Like, what are we going to call behavior? I had another definition for this a little while ago, but I looked this up quite recently and found this incredibly lame, people have a hard time with this because there's this incredibly lame YouTube video that said, behavior is the way in which a person behaves in response to a particular situation or stimulus, which is not helpful. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you 3 videos, and I'm going to ask you at the end to raise your hand and tell me which of them you think depicts behavior and which doesn't. And so they're just different organisms doing things, and so just so you're prepared. And the first 2 do have music accompanying them, but I did not choose the music, but I think it's kind of fun, so okay. So let's see. So this is a peacock spider. They're native to Australia, and this is a male. And if you're ever bored, or in fact, if you're bored right now, if you Google peacock spider displays, like there's tons of them online, and they're lots of fun. And the spider is like smaller than your pinky fingernail. It's like this big. That was the female you just saw. That's the male. I'm gonna stop now. Okay, the second one is, this is obviously a Venus flytrap. Again, I did not pick the music. I think it's kind of funny. On that one. And this is just, so there's no music on this one because this is just single cells, and I guess, I don't know, people don't think that's accompanied by music or something. Anyway, the video wasn't accompanied by this. So this is just white blood cells that are consuming a pathogen, so, you know, the process of phagocytosis. And this one probably takes even less time to get the idea of what's going on. So. Okay. Oops, sorry, I should have stopped there. Okay. You didn't see that. All right, so hands up, who thought the spider was exhibiting behavior? Okay. Who thought the Venus flytrap was, so not the fly trap was exhibiting behavior? Okay. How many of you thought the white blood cells exhibiting behavior? Oh, interesting. Okay. So I've done this a bunch of times, as you might have guessed. And so everybody's on board with the spider. There's usually, it was definitely a minority of people who think the Venus flytrap was doing behavior. And people are really pretty much, about the cell. And the point I want to make about this is not to give you a hard and fast permanent definition of behavior, but to point out that the boundary between behavior and other sorts of traits, physiological, morphological, whatever, is not really very well defined. And what that means, and the way I put this in shorthand, is that behavior is not special. And people often act like they don't mind talking about the evolution of height or eye color and how those are influenced by genes. But when you start talking about the evolution of intelligence or whether you're good at playing the piano, they say, oh, no, we can't talk about it the same way because they're so heavily influenced by culture, which is another word for the environment. The thing is that if the boundary between behavior and other traits is blurry, and I really think it is, then behavior isn't special or different, and it evolves exactly the same way that morphological or physiological characteristics do. And so that means that we shouldn't talk about behavior evolving as though the existence of culture or the environmental influence on it, it's not like culture is this special force that only affects behavior. It's not a get out of evolution free card. It doesn't mean that, we can't talk about intelligence evolving because that's behavior and that's some weird thing. And that's not because, it's genetically determined. It's because all characteristics, whether they're physical or behavioral or a combination of both, are influenced by the interaction of environment and genes. And again, I feel like people have this very funny sort of back and forth about how they talk about it, because we've known forever that there is a genetic basis of behavior, both in animals and humans. We've known it before we could study actual genes. A classic example of this is hygienic behavior in honeybees. Anybody who's kept bees knows that when the colony gets diseased, there's behaviors that the workers do to rid the colony of diseased individuals. It turns out that there's two behaviors that they do. They uncap a cell that has an infected larva, and then they will remove the larva, and those are two distinct behaviors. This was studied, very classic work by Rothenbuehler in the 1960s. And who did crosses that showed that you could get offspring that would uncap the cell but not take the larva out. And you could also get individuals that if they wouldn't do anything unless you uncap the cell, and if you uncap the cell, they would take the larva out. And they concluded it was two genes with two alleles. We now know there's a few more genes involved, but it's Mendelian. And so clearly there's a relationship between genes and behavior. But at the same time, we also need to recognize, and again, most of us recognize and then we don't really talk about it like this, that genes don't code for behaviors. And I think there's a lot of unfortunate language that happens with regard to this. I mean, not just actually for behavior, but for everything else. So that, for instance, there was a study a number of years ago that found a link between genes that are associated with metabolic rate in people and the likelihood of having anorexia. There was an article in The Guardian reporting on this research that stressed that, because there's the lack of a solely environmental cause, we shouldn't blame people for not being able to, not have anorexia, or assume that the only reason people develop it is because they are staring too long at pictures of skinny models in magazines. And the quote from the summary article said, it's potentially a breakthrough in how broader society views those who suffer from it and perhaps how they see themselves. But that's weird because the implication is that we can't control behaviors with a genetic basis. But then at the same time, we know that's ridiculous because we treat anorexia by changing aspects of the environment. And so I feel like this stuff gets really muddled in the way people think about how behavior evolves. And that's even true when we think not about humans, but about animal behavior. And I think we use animal behavior to think about the nature-nurture controversy a lot. And again, I've just pulled some headlines from popular science things. And for some reason, people are super obsessed with this idea that when animals turn out to be more like people than they had thought. And so there was, human-like intelligence in animals is far more common, the rest of this says, than we thought. Elephants may be more like humans than we realized. Horses share personality-related genes with humans, findings show. And then kind of my favorite is that praying mantises more deadly than we knew. Like, how deadly did we think they were? I don't really quite understand the contrast here. But anyway, there's this interest in trying to trace where the genetic underpinnings of behavior come from and how similar they are to people. And certainly, again, genes matter for behavior, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples because they don't matter in the way that people often think. So this example comes from dogs, specifically from a breed of dog called the Australian Kelpie. And these are working dogs. They're used to help farmers in herding cattle or sheep. And they're described, they're loyal, they're alert, intelligent. All of those are behavioral traits, right? And we know that, artificial selection and domestication show us that we can choose dogs and we can get dog breeds that behave in certain ways. But what does that actually mean about how the genes change? And this is work done by Claire Wade from the University of Sydney. And she in her lab found a gene that was demonstrated to be different in working and non-working kelpies. And the gene's associated, it's a nervous system gene, it's associated with pain perception. Well, how do you get from there to being alert and, brave and, whatever else it is? What does that have to do with herding and being able to work for long hours, often with no supervision? And it turns out that it has to do with the prickles. And this is a quote from an email that she sent me. The ability to feel pain is a stop-go requirement for working kelpies. In outback Australia, the ground coverings are extremely prickly. I was visiting a friend, and my dog ran out into the field, but then froze and would no longer move. I needed to go and carry her back to the soft grass. We call that being a prickle princess. Kelpies cannot be a prickle princess, or they never have a chance to demonstrate their ability for moving sheep. And I will say, just sidebar here, it's kind of creepy how many images I could find on Google if I just entered princess dog. Seriously, I don't know what people are thinking. But anyway, this is one of them. All right. So what does that mean about the evolution of behavior? It means that there is no gene for herding. The same thing is true for other behaviors. Instead, what happens is that individuals that act in a certain way, this is exactly what Jonathan was just talking about, in this case, because they're not as sensitive to prickles, are the ones that are selected to breed, and we end up with dogs that behave differently from their ancestors. Now, there's no place where the idea of behavior and genetics, come together more vividly than in discussions of mental disorders. And indeed, that's true, with people as well as animals. There's a long history of interest in how human mental disorders could be inherited, what's their genetic basis, how did they evolve. Indeed, the first work that was ever done in human behavioral genetics centered around the inheritance of insanity. Okay, well, what about animals? So Darwin was interested in this, as he was in so many things, and he said that insanity in animals demonstrated the continuity of living things. There have been, a number of other books written about this. Laurel Braitman, who wrote a book called Animal Madness, says, well, any animal with a mind has the capacity to lose hold of it from time to time. And there's kind of three views about mental illness in non-humans. The first one, which is surprisingly common, is that animals can serve as a model for human mental disorders. I mean, they are serving as a model for human mental disorders, but they don't themselves suffer from them. And Joshua Gordon, who is the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, said very flatly, mice do not have schizophrenia or any other mental illness. Another view is that animals can have what you might call mental illness, but it's only because humans mistreat them or maybe they're in captivity. So, blame it on humans when animals become mentally ill. The third idea, though, is that animals, because of this continuity of life, have their own version of mental disorders. And that's the idea that I think is the most likely. And Randy Nesse, who I guess was just here for the ISEMF meeting, and who is, of course, a pioneer in evolutionary medicine, wrote this great book called Good Reasons for Bad Feelings, in which he asks more broadly, why did natural selection leave our bodies with traits that make us vulnerable to disease? And there's lots of answers to this, but a point that he makes, which I think is very salient here, is that saying that disorders are there for a reason is vastly different than saying they're there for a purpose. And when it comes to mental illness, we can construct lots of stories about how mental disorders might have been advantageous to our ancestors. There was just a study suggesting that ADHD was, advantageous because people who had it would have been better foragers in our evolutionary history. But that assumes that such disorders must have a purpose. And I think that's incorrect. Maybe instead, and this is what Randy suggests, mental disorders aren't a disease but a symptom. And so what he says is that anxiety and low mood, both of which have to do with mental disorders, they exist for the same reason as pain and nausea. They're useful in certain situations, but they are not themselves the disease. And he uses what he often refers to as the smoke detector principle, that overshooting, in other words, reacting to something that's not really a threat, the way a smoke detector would react when you burn the toast, is useful because it means that you don't miss anything that is a real fire. And so you just get dysfunction sometimes. And therefore, that third explanation is likely to be the correct one. We expect animals to also get that kind of dysfunction. So we don't really have to choose whether animal mental illness is exactly like that of people, or whether, that animals don't ever get mental illness. We don't have to choose between those, because even if animals exhibit symptoms that look like human mental disorders, that doesn't mean they're the same thing. It's just that we have common evolutionary roots. So I'll give you another example with more dogs. This is a disorder called canine compulsive disorder. It's very similar to obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, in humans. It's called canine. It's got a canine instead of the O because we don't know what's going on in the minds of the dogs, so we don't know whether they're obsessed with stuff or not. But it manifests very similarly in that in dogs, CCD means that a dog does a normal behavior to excess. So flank chewing, which is something dogs do, it does it repetitively. Circling, how dogs will make a circle before they lie down. These dogs that have this disorder will do that over and over and over and over again. The disorder is treated the same way with similar medications in dogs and people. That medication often is not terribly effective. Dobermans turn out to be particularly prone to CCD. And it's been studied for a long time by Eleanor Carlson at the Broad Institute and University of Massachusetts. And she and her coworkers found, again, a gene that seems to be relevant. It has to do with how nerve cells communicate. But, and it's, it's very, the disorder is very heritable, but it still only explains a small proportion of the risk. And so if you look at Dobermans, and you look at whether or not they have one or two copies of that gene that Carlson's lab identified, if they have two normal genes, there's still a 10% chance they'll exhibit CCD. If they have one normal and one abnormal gene, 25% chance. Both abnormal genes, it's still only 60%. It's not deterministic. And so in all cases, genes in the environment are interacting. And, I feel like we seem to want it both ways. that people want to use the genetic basis of behavior as a way to kind of give people an out, to stop blaming themselves, to say, oh, well, you can't change your genes, it's just inevitable, don't worry about it, it's all okay. On the other hand, people sometimes want to use that as a basis for not doing anything with the environment, like don't bother spending public money on interventions that have to do with childhood intelligence because, oh, well, they can't be changed anyway. And there is, again, I feel like we've got this really sort of dichotomous view that we just can't seem to get over. And we try and we say, oh, our genes are not our destiny. And then in the next breath, you say, oh, well, but your genes are loading the gun and your lifestyle pulls the trigger. I don't even know what it's a weird analogy anyway, but I just looked, I literally Googled, genes and destiny, and I found tons and tons and tons of things that show this uneasiness that we have with both of them. And so I think it is this problem with killing the zombie, because this stuff is really hard to think about. It's not that you have this, if you say, oh, well, it's both genes and the environment, then people immediately want to know, but what proportion is what? Like what proportion is genes, what proportion is the environment? And telling them that it's not additive somehow doesn't seem to compute. And I think some of this has to do, again, with terminology. I really feel like the term heritability is a ghastly word, and I really wish we didn't use it, but we're kind of stuck with it. And, so the thing of how to kill a zombie, so because all traits, physical, behavioral, physiological, everything, are the result of interaction between genes and the environment. So if you want to kill a zombie, apparently you have to choose your weapon, aim for the head and don't miss. And so, the big question is, what's our weapon and how we're going to manage to aim for the head. I just want to finish by acknowledging some of the people that contributed to my thinking on this. I belong to a really fun discussion group at Minnesota called that's part of the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science that has a biology interest group where I get to talk to philosophers about some of this stuff. I've had lots of animal behavior students, and also, like I said, Hamish Spencer worked on this. And I also wanted to give a real shout out to all of the people that have contributed to this fantastic symposium, and also to Andy Flick, who's just really managed stuff terribly, terribly well. So thank you.